Welcome to Beyond the FAR from GW Law's Government Procurement Law Program, where experts unpack the business of government. And now, here's your host, Dean Jessica Tillipman.
Hello and welcome to Beyond the FAR. My name is Jessica Tillipman and I am your host. We have a great episode for you today. Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics because it's near and dear to my heart, which is kind of integrity and anti-corruption efforts in government procurement. But first, some background before I introduce our wonderful guest. In government spending, fraud, waste, and abuse are a known risk, especially when you're spending over $750 billion a year in government procurement. The goal of oversight is not perfect prevention. It is to stop as much as possible, detect what gets through, and then correct the conditions that enabled it. The United States has one of the most sophisticated government oversight infrastructures in the world, particularly in procurement because, as I said before, billions of dollars move through contracts and grant programs every year, but 755, I believe, billion a year most recently. Inspectors General, or IGs, are our government's watchdogs. They operate independently inside agencies to audit, inspect, investigate, and then report on waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement. And they play a critical role in strengthening integrity and accountability across federal programs. According to a most recent report, this is FY24 from the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, as we fondly call CIGI. IG offices generated about $18 in return for every dollar invested in OIGs. Our guest today, Robert Storch, served until January 2025 as the Senate-confirmed Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Defense. As DoD IG, he led more than 1,850 personnel across 50-plus offices worldwide, conducting nonpartisan audits, investigations, and evaluations of DoD programs and personnel. He also served as the Special Inspector General, coordinating oversight of the U.S. assistance to Ukraine, and as lead Inspector General for two other overseas contingency operations. He has held senior leadership roles across the federal oversight community, including as chair of the Defense Council on Integrity and Efficiency, and as a member of the CIGI Executive Council, where he also chaired the Technology Committee, something I'm going to ask him about today. Previously, he served as the first Senate-confirmed Inspector General at the National Security Agency and as Deputy Inspector General and Whistleblower Ombudsperson at the Department of Justice, and spent more than 2 decades as a federal prosecutor, including in DOJ's Public Integrity Section. He is also an experienced legal educator, having taught courses on anti-corruption, government oversight, and inspectors general at leading law schools, including GW, with upcoming teaching focused on the future of oversight and accountability. All right. Robert Storch. Rob, welcome to Beyond the FAR. It is a great pleasure to have you here and an honor as well.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. These are important topics, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you about it.
Well, I'm just going to kick this off from the outset. So we have a global audience that listens to the Beyond the FAR podcast, given our role in procurement and the procurement community. So I gave us a little bit of a taste, but I would love it for individuals who are maybe not as familiar. Could you kind of tell everybody what an IG is and what they do and why they're so important within the government?
Sure. Happy to do so. And again, thank you for having me. As you said during your introduction, in the United States, we are very fortunate to have a very robust oversight ecostructure or system. And one of the key parts of it over the last 50 years or so are our inspectors general. And so it started with the Inspector General Act of 1978, which was one of the reforms that was put in place after Watergate and other public corruption scandals in the 70s. And it started with a limited number, and now there are inspectors general in virtually every executive branch agency, and actually some congressional as well. And about half of them, 36 of them, I believe the number, are appointed by the president and or nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And then the others are appointed by the heads of the agency and can be dismissed by the head of the agency. And so they have the same duties and responsibilities, just in a different way of being appointed. So what do IGs do? Basically, when I think of our work, you can divide it up into two general categories. One is programmatic oversight and one is investigative oversight. The programmatic oversight consists of audits and evaluations where we look at programs and operations of the departments and agencies that we oversee. And audits and evaluations are very similar. The audits are done pursuant to GAGAS, Yellow Book, GAO developed standards. The evaluations are done pursuant to the Blue Book, which is something that's put in place by SIGI, the organization you mentioned, to provide standards and provides a little bit more flexibility in doing the review, still results in authoritative findings and then recommendations. And that's a critical point of all of our work. All of this is designed to have a positive impact on the programs and operations of the agencies we oversee. And so in doing that work, whenever we make a negative finding or find a problem, we'll always make a recommendation that, if adopted by the agency, will help the agency to address the problem we identified. So all of that programmatic work also uncovers all sorts of waste and other financial potential savings. As you mentioned, it's at least $18. I've actually seen numbers as high as 26 for every dollar. Whatever the right number is, it's a lot of money that's saved for the American taxpayer through the programmatic work, but then also our investigative work. And in that, we're looking at really two types of things. One is administrative investigations involving misconduct by department or agency personnel. And so we'll investigate that. And if we substantiate the misconduct, we'll do a report that goes to the head of the agency or department. And then it's up to them to take action. As with our programmatic work, we don't have authority to require the agency to do anything. I always used to tell my folks, that's why they call them recommendations, right? It's up to the agency to take the action necessary to address the issues. And if we find misconduct, any disciplinary action or other action taken with regard to an employee, up to and including dismissal potentially, would be up to the department or agency to decide. So we do that. And then we also do criminal investigations. And that's not true of all the OIGs, but many of the OIGs have criminal investigative arms. At DOD, where I was privileged to work most recently, we have the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, which actually slightly predates the OIG. And then with the advent of the DOD IG, became the investigative arm of our office. And so they have agents all over the world, all over the United States, doing criminal investigations involving both conduct of DOD personnel, but also importantly, fraud, misconduct in connection with DOD programs and operations around the world. So it's a robust set of programmatic and investigative oversight. And then DOD, you mentioned the Ukraine work and the overseas contingency operations. At DOD, we sort of have an additional responsibility, which is with our partners at state OIG and USAID OIG. Under the law, whenever there's what's called an overseas contingency operation, our offices conduct coordinated oversight over the different aspects of that. And because they've all pretty much been military, the DOD IG has been the lead in those overseas contingency operations, including ongoing ones related to ISIS, related to the aftermath of Afghanistan, and then Operation Atlantic Resolve, including U.S. assistance to Ukraine. So there was some discussion about potentially creating yet another IG for the Ukraine assistance. And it was up to Congress to decide. We kept doing the oversight, doing oversight over the security assistance, and then coordinating all the other oversight. And ultimately, Congress decided to appoint my office, and ultimately me, I suppose, as the Special Inspector General overseeing all aspects of U.S. assistance to Ukraine. So that's something that a few of us have that additional responsibility as well. And as you mentioned, we have a big, diverse team in more than 50 offices, both CONUS and OCONUS, as we say, and all over the world doing that important work.
Well, I want to take that back, and it's fascinating. I'm glad
Sure.
you actually touched on what a special inspector general is, because I think sometimes people don't realize that's an additional kind of subset. But let's talk. You said first about kind of fraud and waste and abuse, and since January, we've heard a lot about the word fraud. And as someone who teaches anti-corruption and compliance with very distinct legal definitions between kind of criminal fraud, like the civil false claims, which I would actually define as less fraud and more recklessness, though we could quibble about what that definition is. But then also things like kind of waste and abuse, because we often hear fraud, waste, and abuse. And I want to also talk about some studies that actually show like what's the most frequent. But let's put that to the side, and we're going to get to it. But maybe tell people what it is, because I've heard the word fraud thrown about so much this year in 2025, and so much of it in an incorrect way. So tell everybody, what is the distinction between fraud, waste, and abuse?
Yeah, it's a great question, and those terms get thrown around, as you say, all the time, right? So when in the IG community, and I'll just give you a general take on it, and there may be specific permutations, but basically what we're talking about is where there are specified legal requirements or relationships, if there is funding or there are efforts that are made to procure or contracting or whatever in violation of those. Now, sometimes you have waste where money is just not being used efficiently, not being used effectively. There may be funds to better use where the funds are being used, but there would be better ways to use them, that sort of thing. And that's not typically fraud. Fraud usually implies some intentional violation of some known legal duty. There can be that can be dealt with both in administrative, and then also it could be potentially criminal. And as you mentioned, I spent a couple dozen years as a federal prosecutor doing corruption and white collar fraud and crime cases. There's a specific intent requirement in those to prove that people are intentionally violating some legal duty that they have. So, changing priorities happen all the time, but that doesn't automatically equate with fraud. In fact, it really isn't fraud. It's just changing priorities, right? And so the question is, are you intentionally violating some legal responsibility? And that's a very general sort of way to think about fraud, and distinct from waste, where the money's just not being used effectively.
So, and thank you for that clarification, because I think it's one that those of us that work in this space have very much been trying to explain to people for the last, I mean, we're going to say like almost 12 months, what the distinctions are, because they're meaningful. They have significantly different legal consequences when we're talking about it. I know with IGs, and a lot of it's kind of the audit and investigation, but you also play an important role with whistleblowers too, right? Isn't that a component of that? Could you maybe tell us how whistleblowing, especially in procurement, how that relates to your work, or even what people see inside the agency or people even outside the agency?
Yeah, absolutely. It's critically important. The departments and agencies where we work around the United States are so big and so complex that we really depend upon people coming forward when they see something that they think is wrong, right? And my mantra is always, those people perform a public service when they come forward, and they never should suffer reprisal for doing so. So in the OIGs, we all have hotlines where people can report concerns. Whatever it is they know, we encourage them to report. They can report those concerns. They can identify themselves, in which case we can follow up with them. Or if they don't feel comfortable identifying themselves, they can report anonymously. And if they do that, we want to make sure we get as much information as we can, because we won't be able to go back to them for more information, obviously, right? But it's critically important that people who are on the front lines, and as I used to say at DOD, they may actually be on the front lines, come forward when they see something that they think is wrong, so that somebody like an OIG can look into it. And then if there's something there, can take any necessary action. So it's incredibly important. And the bigger the enterprise, and as you mentioned, the government is huge. The bigger the enterprise, the more important that is. DOD, for instance, I mean, you're talking about a budget in the neighborhood of $850 billion. People say like half the discretionary spending of the United States, 3/4 of the property is held by DOD. Whatever the exact numbers are, it's huge. And so while there are all sorts of entities out there within the DOD structure who do audits and reviews, and then the OIG sort of looking over all of it, we really depend upon people coming forward, and we want to encourage them to do that.
I'm fascinated by this because, I work a lot with on the company side too,
Yeah.
or like advising companies. And one of the issues we always talk about is the role of hotlines. And I wrote about this once. I had this story once where somebody told me a story about how, not somebody told me a story. I told the story. I wrote the story because I had been speaking to a board of directors, and I was talking to them about the importance of having ways to report, and it can be a variety of things, hotlines, portals, et cetera. And the person said, well, we don't have any corruption or fraud issues in our company. We never get calls on our hotline. And I said, okay, if you're not getting calls on your hotline, it's because people don't know about it or they don't trust it. And so what I had told them is that in a company on the private sector side, like you should be getting, for like every nugget of something you need to really pull a thread, you should be getting a lot of like stuff that's just really not going to go anywhere. You should have some more noise on it because it means people trust it and they know about it to use it, even if it doesn't materialize. Did you find that a lot where you get a lot of stuff where you're like, I don't know if people really understand what a hotline's for. Do you really just get pure like stuff that he really is well-meaning or actually potentially could lead to legal consequences?
So again, this is all me personally. We encourage people. Always encourage people to report. When in doubt, report, and let us sort of sort through it. You get all sorts of allegations, and that's fine. If people think they've seen something or heard something that may not be right, then we encourage them to report so we can look into it. And to your point about reporting, one of the reasons that I hope people feel comfortable doing that is something else about the IG system we haven't touched on is that we're completely nonpartisan and we are independent in conducting our oversight work. So people should feel comfortable reporting to the IG, knowing that it's a safe place to report. There are other places you can report as well. Obviously, the Office of Special Counsel in the U.S. government plays an important role with regard to whistleblowers. But I care less. You can report to GAO. You can report to lots of places. But what's more important to me is that people report. And when in doubt, we encourage people to report. Sure, we get all sorts of stuff. And then what we'll try to do is try to help people and direct them to the right place if it isn't something, or if the IGs will. When I say we, I'm obviously not there anymore. But the IGs will try to direct people to the right place if they can. But the important thing is that people come forward and report, and that we provide a safe, confidential channel to do that.
I'm glad you mentioned the idea of independence, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that independence and why it's so important. Because, in recent months, we've seen the IG function within agencies and SIGI itself and criticized as being partisan. And so I know in my work, I very much stress the independence. So I would love for you basically to respond to that, the criticism that, if you don't like what the IG has to say, that maybe it's partisan, and maybe you can go into kind of that dynamic between what an IG does, why it's so important to be independent, and then what opportunities an agency has to respond if they don't like what the IG has to say, and what that methodology looks like.
Yeah, those are all great questions. Let me try to break them out. So, independence and nonpartisanship, both critically important to our work. By law, IGs are, as I mentioned, independent offices. It really is interesting to your point about the structure of U.S. oversight. We're located within the departments and agencies we oversee, right? We're under the general supervision, which is sort of a nominal supervision of the head of the agencies. But by law, we are independent in conducting our oversight work. So what that means is, we certainly want to hear from agency leadership, from Congress, from stakeholders, NGOs, whatever, in terms of potential issues or concerns. But we decide what we look at, whether it's programmatic or investigative. Congress can pass a law requiring us to do a review of something. That's the one exception for that. And if they pass a law, then we follow the law, right? We're rule followers. But short of Congress passing a law requiring us to do a programmatic review, we decide independently what it is we're going to look at. And then we are, I think it's fair to say, we have to be, in order for this to work, independent in carrying out those functions, right? So we are entitled by law to access to all information that's available to the department or agency that we oversee. And so because we're within it, privileges that might apply outside don't apply to us, right? And so we're able to get that information. It may restrict what we're able to put out publicly. And that's fine, but we put out as much as we can because transparency is really important. We do all this ultimately for the American people, but we get that information and we independently assess it and reach our independent conclusions. The department or agency can disagree with us. They can tell us that we're wrong. But ultimately we make the final call regarding that, right? So that independence is critically important. In carrying that out in a way that is credible and authoritative, it is absolutely essential that we be completely nonpartisan. As I used to tell my folks all the time, so much of what we do is of political interest. It is just absolutely essential that we be nonpartisan and not even have a hint of partisanship in our work. So I can give you a couple of examples. So on the Ukraine work that we've mentioned that we did a lot of what I think of as, we always are very fair. We try to hit it down the fairway. I can't do it in golf, but we do it in oversight. A lot of really, I think, hard-hitting oversight relating to U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, including really impactful reports on things like tracking of the most sensitive equipment and things like that. And if people thought that we were partisan or trying to support the agenda of any particular administration, then we wouldn't maybe do that hard-hitting work. Or if we did it, it wouldn't necessarily be credible. Or if we found there was improvement, that wouldn't be credible. It wouldn't be authoritative. The departments couldn't rely upon it. The Congress couldn't rely upon it. The public couldn't rely upon it. So it's critically important that we be nonpartisan. By law, inspectors general are required to be appointed without regard to political affiliation, but based upon integrity and demonstrated skills in law, accounting, other areas that are relevant to our oversight work. And I personally, the other example, for what it's worth, I sometimes think of myself as kind of a poster child for nonpartisan oversight. I actually served, you mentioned, as the NSA IG. I was a nominee of President Trump in the first administration, and in that role. And served almost 5 years, having been confirmed by the Senate by unanimous consent for that job. And then President Biden nominated me to be the Inspector General for the larger DOD. As folks may know, NSA is within the DOD, but has its own Inspector General, as do a number of DOD components. And then I was nominated by President Biden to be the Inspector General for the entire Department of Defense, and then confirmed by the Senate by, I think it was a 92-3 vote or something like that. So I used to have on my wall both Trump and a Biden appointment certificate, and I had them sort of opposite looking at each other. And I always thought it was a good metaphor because honestly, it doesn't make any difference to us who the president, and it shouldn't make any difference. I can't speak for the future, but it shouldn't make any difference who that is. Because it's really critically important for this work to be authoritative, for it to be credible, that it not be seen as partisan. And we got to this from whistleblowers. It's really a great point. People have to feel comfortable coming forward and feel that they're going to get a fair shake. And if people think that we are partisan or an arm of, and I don't care about politics, oversight isn't political, right? But if people think we're an arm of whoever happens to be in, authority at that point, then they're not going to feel comfortable coming forward, or that we're going to give them a fair shake. And so it's really critically important for the system to work, that IGs do their work independently and that they be just resolutely nonpartisan. It is not a job for someone who wants to curry favor with the administration. I used to tell my folks all the time, I've got my wife and kids to love me. I want the departments and the agencies to respect our work and the Congress to respect our work.
I love that you just said that because, yes, it's definitely not a position for people that want everyone to be happy with them. So if you consistently need to seek outside approval, because the IG, you play a really unique role where you are everybody. I mean, no disrespect, like nobody likes to be told they're doing something wrong or
Sure.
inefficiently or ineffectively. So, that's a really tough job to play. And so I love that you said that, like, if you need external validation, this is not the job for you, by people. I mean, except from you, I'm sure you're we're very supportive of your team. But from
I love
outside,
people. People are everything.
yeah,
So whatever organization you're in, your people are everything, right?
right.
And I hope I live those words. But I will say, regardless of whether Republicans or Democrats or whoever was in power, leaders, in my experience, always appreciated the value of that independent oversight. And to your point, Jessica, one of the things that I think is true in any organization, is certainly is true in the government, is bad news doesn't travel up well, right? And people are doing programs and, they're trying to do the right thing and they're trying to advance their programs. There may be a few who aren't. And as I always used to say as well, for those, we have our investigative division. We know how to deal with that, right? But I think everybody else is trying to advance their programs. So if you're in procurement, you're trying to advance some program and procure and do all the rest, right? And whether intentionally, because you're trying to make it, look like things are going well, or unintentionally, because you're just so into it, right, that you're not objective. Many times the problems don't come to light, or if they do, they don't make it up to the highest levels that really can affect change. And one of the things IGs, again, with the independence and with the nonpartisanship can do, is bring those issues to the light of decision makers. So I met on a regular basis as the DOD IG, and before that as the NSA IG, and then with IG Michael Horowitz, very much the gold standard on all this, when I was his deputy at DOJ OIG, met with, department leadership, most recently on a regular basis with the secretary, met monthly with the deputy secretary, service secretaries, the undersecretaries, all these different people. And in all three of those jobs, frankly, there are any number of instances where we brought something to light that the leaders weren't aware of, right? Because that news hadn't traveled up and they appreciated knowing about it. So that's one of the ironies and of everything that happened with the mass firings and all the rest of that, is the reason that was given was due to changing priorities. And IGs don't advance the priorities, at least as the system is structured, don't advance the priorities of the administration. The administration can have whatever priorities they want. We do that independent oversight, and that actually helps to achieve whatever the goals are, because we bring those problems to light that might not otherwise see the light of day. And that's not going to make you popular, but it's really important for good government, for uncovering, again, whether it's waste or fraud or abuse of office. We didn't talk about, whether it's that, whatever it is, or corruption, right? You need someone who can speak truth to power in these jobs. And, we used to kid at Justice, you get on the elevator, everybody gets off. It's not quite like that, but this isn't a job for someone who's, looking for validation, as you say.
So true. And since you led us down this path, let's
Yeah,
talk
sure.
about the oversight environment since January. And you talked about the IG firing, so I want to touch on that and
Mhm.
what's happened. And then for those folks that haven't been paying as much attention, there was some back and forth, and there was a issue about defunding SIGI,
Yeah.
which is an incredibly important resource. And I say this on a personal standpoint. I was writing an article where I was citing the Technology Committee report one day, and the next day it was completely
Yeah.
gone because they took oversight.gov offline.
Right.
And so we've seen a dramatic shakeup of the oversight infrastructure within the United States. And some of that has been because it's been criticized by the current administration as politicized, or, again, as you noted, a competing priority or different priorities, which, again, for an independent entity, that doesn't resonate with what you and I both know about the IG system. So I would love to hear kind of your take on this, in terms of what we're looking at as 2025 comes to a close, what has happened in the last year?
Sure, happy to do that. And you mentioned you've got an international audience. Wherever oversight occurs, I think a core principle for it is having the independence necessary to conduct that oversight. There are different structures. We have ours, other places have different ones, but at the sort of an underlying bedrock principle is you have that independence that you're able to do that. And what happened, for those who may not know, on the first Friday night of the new administration on January 24th, a group of us, ultimately, I think we determined 17 inspectors general across the federal government, received emails from the Office of Presidential Personnel informing us that, again, due to changing priorities, our positions were terminated effective immediately. Thank you for your service, they said. And so let me just say, so on that, I would say that obviously very concerning for a couple of reasons, at least. One, the notices did not comply with the Inspector General Act, which required notice to Congress, not to me, but notice to Congress at least 30 days in advance with detailed reasons as to why the Inspector General was put in place. And that's a provision that had been beefed up recently to ensure that Congress at least had an opportunity to engage as to the reasons why an Inspector General was being dismissed. So the failure to do that really undermines one of the core principles that supports that independence. We are obligated to keep the head of the agency and the Congress fully and timely informed. So Congress has an important role in ensuring the independence of inspectors general. So that was really troubling to see that happen. And then obviously there's a concern about the chilling effect. There were still many outstanding women and men across the oversight community, across the inspector general community, who go to work every day and are trying to do effective oversight. But when you sort of decapitate so many offices of their leadership, the concern is that could have a chilling effect on the works of the office and the willingness to take on some of those tough, controversial issues that sometimes we deal with. And I always say, if there was any doubt about that, about 10 days later, the Inspector General from USAID, Paul Martin, great Inspector General, long experienced, had been the deputy at Justice before, then at NASA, then at USAID, issued a report, his office did, finding, not surprisingly, that if you leave food assistance and out on the docks, it may get stolen or it may go bad, right? And he was dismissed the next day. Without any explanation. And there have been others dismissed since then. There have been actings. So people are continuing to try, I believe, to do oversight in a very challenging environment this year. Again, going back to what we talked about before, if that's going to be possible for the system to work, it's going to require inspectors general who are willing to take on the tough tasks, who are willing not to be popular with leadership, but are willing to do that independent oversight. And sometimes, they're not going to like what you have to say, but you got to speak truth to power. And you do it credibly, and you do it in the way that people know, look, just hitting it down the fairway, right? Just saying what happened. And so you have to be able to do that. And you have to have access to the information that you need in order to carry it out. So it's up to those inspectors general, it's up to the heads of the agencies to support that oversight, ultimately. And I've been very fortunate where I've worked, to have, again, regardless of whichever party is in power, it's not a political issue. People have supported the idea of the value of independent oversight. So you have to have that from your agency leadership. And then Congress and the way the law is structured. And I mentioned the dynamic of the way in which we inform the head of the agency in Congress. But if we have problems, as inspectors general, we go to Congress. And it's important that Congress stand up for independent oversight that actually plays a pivotal role in not only improving the operations of the agencies directly, but also informing congressional, both their legislative responsibilities and their oversight responsibilities, which are constitutional responsibilities of Congress, right? And they depend heavily on inspectors general, as you know, to provide information. I mean, the procurement area, My former office, DoD OIG, did a ton of work in that area. We had a whole division within our audit group that was devoted to acquisition, contracting, and sustainment, and did lots of work. And that's really important for the department and really important for Congress, which is very interested in those issues. We did, just to give you an example, and I think it was October, we released a report looking at the procurement of spare parts by the Air Force for the C-17. You may have seen this report. It got some attention. And again, we never do stuff seeking attention. That's not the job. But a lot of our work is of public interest, and that's great. It's for the American people, and people need to know it's their government. So absent classified information or otherwise, I've always pushed transparency. I think it's a core principle for IGs. But anyway, on this C-17 report, that's the big transport. That's why my hands are here. Big transport that the Air Force uses. And we looked at the acquisition of spare parts, which has been an issue in the department for years, as you well know. And if I have the numbers committed to memory right, I believe we found that 26% of the sample that we looked at, the Air Force paid more than fair and reasonable price for the spare parts. And then in another 54%, they didn't keep sufficient documentation, which is its own challenge, didn't keep sufficient documentation in order for us to tell, for our auditors to tell. So for 80% of the spare parts, we found that the government, the American taxpayer, paid more than fair and reasonable pricing, or you couldn't tell if they did. And sort of the one example that a lot of folks have highlighted from the report is there was a soap dispenser for the C-17, and we found that the government paid 7,943% markup, so almost an 8,000% markup on a soap dispenser, right? And that sort of thing is troubling. But we don't just, make these negative findings. As I say, we made a bunch of recommendations to assist them in addressing the issues that we found in our report that, if carried out, will help. So that's just one example of many, but one that's sort of germane to the particular subject matter of this discussion, where an OIG has gone in and done effective oversight. Now, the department, like all departments, has its own auditors, and they do great work, but there's tons of work to be done. And then it's really important that you have an independent entity like the OIG that can come in and look at it from sort of a higher level view and look across the department to find issues. And if they don't agree with us, you asked me about that before, I should have mentioned, if they don't agree, they have the right not to agree. Both during our report, there's a process where we always solicit the input of the department or agency, and we'll consider that, and we may revise our findings or recommendations, or we may not, and we always explain why we've made the decision we've made. And then afterwards, there's a robust process regarding the recommendations that we made of tracking and working with the department to keep track and to make sure that they're taking action sufficient to address the recommendations. But ultimately, their recommendations, it's up to them.
I have so many questions, and you've taken me in like three different directions. So I'm trying to figure out which one to ask first. So since you kind of got onto the very procurement specific stuff, one issue that interests me and has interested me forever is the mandatory disclosure rule for government contractors, where they're required by law to come forward with information if their contract is worth a certain dollar value. Right now, I think just most recently, the $7.5 million threshold just increased in October, and for a certain period of time. And, I understand that the whole purpose behind the rule was to ensure we were getting more information about kind of fraud and criminal violations, because you actually look what triggers it, or significant overpayments. And there's been a lot of criticism over the years about the fact that people spend a ton of money just for like a tiny overpayment just to get legal counsel to make these disclosures. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about whether, now that you're out of the role and you can talk, the effectiveness of something like this, where the rumor is that you might get some nuggets of some bigger stuff. And I've seen some prosecutions. I've seen DOJ press releases on stuff that came in through mandatory disclosure. But a lot of time people associate now that the vast majority you're getting is like time card fraud or like low level overpayments. And I'm curious what you think of that. If that is like it could be refined in any way?
Yeah. So I may disappoint you a little bit because one of the things that I think is pivotally important for IGs is that we're authoritative because we rely on specific work. And so my personal opinions about things, I certainly have opinions like everybody else. But there, that's the sort of thing that it's an interesting question, but I don't have a particularly strong view. If I can, and y'all can do with this as well. But one of the things I didn't touch on that you asked about before was SIGI, and I don't want to lose that. So the Council of Inspectors General plays a really important role in the IG community. It's not like an optional thing. It's not like we decided to create a club. It's right in the IG Act. It requires that this organization exist, and it performs really critically important functions for the community, including providing training for thousands of auditors and investigators, including the maintenance of standards and the peer review process, whereby we make sure that offices of Inspector General adhere to those standards. As you mentioned, it has a very robust website, oversight.gov, where there's all sorts of information on this, and it's a great aggregator of OIG reports and everything else. By the way, we created something similar for Ukraine Oversight, which is ukraineoversight.gov, for those who are interested in that, again, to advance transparency regarding U.S. assistance to Ukraine. There's pandemicoversight.gov for the PRAC, which is a committee, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. It's a committee of SIGI that does some fantastic work looking at some $5 trillion in money that was appropriated as a result of the pandemic, and doing both programmatic and investigative work and reporting on that. So SIGI does really important stuff with that. And then there's a robust committee structure, and you mentioned during the intro and before, the technology committee. And so SIGI has committees composed of inspectors general and their teams. There's an audit committee, there's an evaluations committee, there's an investigations committee. There are a whole bunch of different committees that are sort of organized around different practice areas, if you will. And then the technology committee, which I was pleased to serve as vice chair when I was the NSAIG, and chaired the emerging technology subcommittee of that. And then then was pleased to be the chair of the tech committee overall, where we looked at how to conduct oversight over department and agency, basically government use of different technologies, and then also how we use them ourselves in our own increasingly complex work. And so that committee structure is really an incredibly important and valuable way to share information, best practices, to leverage what each of the offices are doing for the good of the greater community. We also did some roll-up work through SIGI, the top management challenges that we're required to do by law. So look thematically across the government at what the top challenges are. With the tech committee, looking at the FISMA, the information security, what we required to do an annual audit at each agency. The OIG does that. And then we did a roll-up looking across the community at issues writ large and work like that. So SIGI is incredibly important. As you alluded to, at the end of September, the administration chose not to give SIGI its apportionment. And the reason for that term is the funds already were there. There's not a separate general allocation, but instead the funds come from the budgets of the different IGs proportionally based on the size of their budgets. So because we had the largest IG, we also had the largest budget. And so we gave a lot for that. But everybody chips in to fund SIGI's important activities because everyone benefits from them, and they're really required to do the oversight. OMB initially chose not to give SIGI its apportionment, basically shutting it down and shutting down the website and putting the good folks who work there out of work. Fortunately, that was remedied, at least for the short term, through January 30th. And, we'll see what happens. But I think it's vitally important for there to be effective oversight, which does all this valuable stuff for the departments and agencies and ultimately for the American taxpayer. It's vitally important that you have a well-funded, robust SIGI that's able to perform those functions. So I didn't want to lose that because it's an incredibly important topic. It may seem a little bit in the weeds for folks, but wherever you work, whether it's here, whether it's around the world, it's great to have structures, and I've been fortunate to do work overseas and everything. It's great to have structures, but if you don't support them properly, it becomes sort of a check the box exercise. And so really what you want to make sure you do is make sure they're appropriately resourced and that they're appropriately supported so they can do the valuable work that they all do.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. When the first day I discovered that the oversight.gov was gone or taken offline, I almost had a heart attack because every single presentation I do everywhere, whether it's to law students or to internationally, is to show them such amazing resources about those kind of shared best practices. And the oversight.gov for law students is actually a great resource for students to think about papers to write. So it was a very tough day. And then I was glad to see it restored. And I'm hopeful that people in the current administration sees the value in it. I want to turn briefly, cognizant of time, to one question I have, which is you talked about best practices. And I know, at least in the procurement community, one of the audits that is getting a lot of attention right now is there's an audit coming out of the Small Business Administration, which is not your agency, but it is an audit of the 8A program that has been announced by the Small Business Administration. Notably, it is the only program within the Small Business Administration of what I call the small business food groups within our small business community that has received this attention. It is, interestingly, it is over a 30-day period. So they announced it at the beginning of December, and people only have 30 days to provide all this information over the holiday period and New Year's Eve to respond to this inquiry. And it's a lot of paperwork that people have to gather and submit. And then it's also being handled by our general counsel's office, or I'm not at the SBA, the general counsel's office, the SBA, which to me seemed unusual for an audit of this nature. So I'm curious your take on that, understanding this isn't your agency, but whether that is considered maybe abnormal, not normal, a best practice, or what you can speak to at least.
Yeah, so I'd say it's a great question. I'll say a couple things. First of all, I appreciate your noting SBA is not where I've worked, but I'd say a couple things. One, we never, when I was working as an IG or in the IG community, we never would tell a department or agency not to look into something, right? If they feel they need to, they've got to do what they need to do. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't as well, though. And I am aware that the 8A program is one that the SBA OIG has done extensive work looking at. If you look at their website, I think there's a whole section on Section 8A oversight that they've done. And so just tons of recommendations there. I'm sure GAO as well. And so a lot of fodder there for ways to make improvement. No program's perfect, as you said at the outset. The goal is to put in place structures that detect and deter problems as much as possible so the programs can achieve their goals. And so the OIG has done a lot of work in that programmatically. And then the other area I mentioned at the outset, investigatively, I know from my years as a white collar prosecutor, SBA has a robust team of agents and offices all around the country who work on cases where it does cross the line into fraud, into criminal conduct. They work with local prosecutors to address those. And I personally have worked on 8A fraud cases. You'd be hard pressed to find a prosecutor who hasn't. That doesn't mean that there's an inordinate amount of fraud in that program versus another program. It just means that there are processes in place to identify and to attempt to address it. So I know that both programmatically and investigatively, there's a large body of work looking at those issues within the OIG. And then, as I also mentioned, GAO. So hopefully that's helpful.
It is helpful. And actually that leads to one thing I want to kind of lead towards a conclusion, which is that, the way you just talked about this in particular, I think it's a great example of it, is that, look, we have instances, we know since the beginning of our conversation that fraud, waste, and abuse are a thing. And we know that is something anytime the government's spending money, that these are going to be things. And so we have this robust architecture in the United States, primarily through IGs, but also through GAO and through whistleblower protections and others. So there's a whole ecosystem in terms of oversight. And, you know, the thing is that you are going to find these cases. And what you just proved is that you'd be hard pressed, and you just said this, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who hasn't dealt with an 8A fraud case. Just like I'm sure people could probably say that for many other types of the small business food groups or any type of program in general, because we know that there's general fraud outside the small business program too. And so the thing worries me, and it's not necessarily just the government, but this is also in companies too, which is how we frame when we find misconduct. Because I think the challenge we have is that people tend to run around saying there's so much fraud and we're going to stamp it out and we're going to eliminate it and we're going to get rid of it. And I have long maintained and said this publicly, that people that walk around saying like, I'm going to eliminate corruption, this is not a serious person. You're never going to do that. The best you can do is, prevention, detection, and mitigation. And so I guess I pose that question to you is like, should we be framing it like this? Because, we come with these explosive headlines and then everyone says the system is broken. And maybe there are things that can be fixed, and that's in your recommendations. Right. But finding fraud and prosecuting is actually a sign that the system's working, right?
Yeah, I agree entirely. Look, whenever you have programs that involve lots of funds, there always are going to be incentives for people to do the wrong thing. And then, as we've talked about, even much more broadly, more than people who are intentionally doing the wrong thing, it's just there's a lot going on. There's a lot of funds. And so there always are ways to improve. And IGs are in that business, as are the other entities that you talked about. So, I'll just share with you when I was still in the chair at DOD. And, people were talking prior to the transition about DOJ and what was that going to be? And nobody really knew. And my reaction was, look, we're in the waste, fraud, and abuse business, right? And so, it's great to have a focus on that. And so we've done a lot of work in that area, and it's work that's done authoritatively, that's done according to the standards we talked about. It's peer reviewed, it's transparent in our reports. And those are all important things, both in terms of the authority of the work, the credibility of the work, not only within the department, but with the Hill and the American public. And so, there's going to be waste, fraud, and abuse in programs. I think that anyone who realistically says there's no fraud in this program, there's no anything, that's someone who's got their head in the sand. And so what you want to do, and what the IG system works hard to do, along with all the other oversight partners and the whistleblowers and everything else that are critically important, is to try to, as effectively as possible, to identify that, to detect it, and then to address it. And we have all these tools that are ready in order to address that. And as we've mentioned from the beginning, there's a tremendous return on investment financially from the oversight community, but then also programmatically, even beyond the dollars, in terms of improving programs and operations, making impactful change, or helping to promote impactful change. It's up to the agencies to do it. But that's all out there.
Yeah, I could talk about this all day. And I have to say, if anybody's listening that's not in the federal space, this is a really great template for people trying to understand how to improve the oversight processes of the government, whether it's outside the U.S. or state and local. But also, even if you're in the United States and you're just kind of curious about it, I think you have to clarify a lot about what an IG actually is and why they are so important and such critical infrastructure for what I call like the oversight and anti-corruption ecosystem in the United States, especially when it comes to procurement. And so I hope people come and take away from this how important it is, and how important it is to maintain its independence, how important it is to fund it, and keep going. And I think you've shed a lot of light on that and demonstrated why it's so valuable. So I thank you for that. And I know this is incredibly helpful, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this.
Well, it's been entirely my pleasure, and the program that you lead is really an important one so that people understand these critical issues. Ultimately, as I say, it's the people's government. Every dollar, it's all taxpayer money, right? And so we want to make sure that it's being used as effectively and efficiently as possible. And so through effective oversight, we hope to make sure that happens. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Rob, thank you so much for joining me on the FAR. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the FAR. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future conversations at the intersection of law, policy, and practice.